到我们进入当中。
The thing that Candice has to realize is that people have different ways of looking at themselves, of looking at their identities. But Candice doesn't really consider herself Chinese anymore. Evidently, Sass is really proud to be Chinese and, has so much fun speaking Mandarin and Cantonese and all of these things. The thing here that's really important is choice and recognizing that culture and identities are not stagnant. These things are evolving even within China. And that's something we want to capitalize on. And that's something we want China to embrace and celebrate because really they have no choice. They are going to be left in the dark if they insist on sticking to only the values of, Mao era people. I'm basically going to look at this debate from the frame of what is in the best interests of the Chinese state. The first question I want to ask is how should China conceptualize its idea of nationalism and what it really means to be Chinese? And secondly, I want to look at the relationship between the state, its people, and these people that it will request to naturalize. And thirdly, I'd like to look at how China should position itself in the global economy, in the global world right now. Let's look at the first idea. How should China conceptualize its idea of nationalism and what it means to be Chinese? Seth told you clearly, and Dwight as well told you, that what it means to be Chinese right now is evolving. For a lot of people, it could mean, yes, being conservative, being traditional, taking care of your elders. For other people, it might be being excellent, going out and making the most out of your resources. But it all goes back toward serving the state, serving the Chinese state, and doing something that gives back to those people. If you listen to Candice's analysis, she sounds exactly like the old grandmother who would get mad at Zhang Zi, no thank you, because she moved out of her parents' house. But the truth and the reality is that there are many people in China who want to do that. That this jump you're talking about, it already occurs right now. But these people feel alienated from the state and they feel alienated from what it means to be Chinese. There's no way to isolate them from the greater world and the greater trend of liberalism. Instead, what China does right now is that it tells them there's just no way to maintain your Chineseness if you want to be liberal. By reaching out to these individuals, you give them concrete examples of accomplished people who they look up to, who said, well, there are different trends of being Chinese and giving back to the state, and we can still be citizens. We can still be good people. Inherently, they had no value to defend once they talked to us about maintaining these old conservative traditional values. We think that the narrative that Cess talked about, the narrative that she defended, one of creating a pride that's more inclusive and more relevant and current, is one that we think will encompass more people and will recommit them to the Chinese state and re-give them the feeling of being able to, participate in it. So we think as far as nationalism goes, we think this makes them more nationalistic. But let's look at the second idea in a bit. What will the relationship be like between the state, these people, and, well, the citizens that we are now acquiring? They told us it's unfair because these people aren't popular, these people aren't liked to begin with. These people will be burdens on the taxpayers. We ask, how is that the case? You're giving them tax cuts and a lump sum. Given the fact that these people will pay you hundreds of thousands in taxes every year because their income is so huge, we don't think it's a loss that you lose out on maybe several tens of thousands a year. Candice told us, no, it's a potentiality. You could have made more money. But then we think there's a net benefit because you wouldn't have made any of that money in the first place. It's almost like courting a foreign direct investment because this person comes to your country, pays you lots of taxes each year, courts projects, courts tourism revenue. So we don't think they're burdening anyone at all. What about the lump sum, they ask us? We think the state will have returns on investment, clearly, but secondly, not all of the state's money comes from taxpayers to begin with. The state, especially the Chinese state, makes lots of investments that don't come from taxpayers' money. We think this can be one of those investments, and you can use money from investments in foreign bonds or the interest paid to it on its debts by the United States in terms of paying out these people if you have such a problem. We think it's unfair for you to say, well, we don't want to reward people whose immigrant parents left. We think that completely spits in the face of the experience of immigrant families. It's extremely unfair to generalize that just because you left, you're an awful person and you don't care about China or your home country anymore. Lots of people still care very much about the countries to which they are ethnically connected. We think an important component of them agreeing to take on citizenship, aside from the great incentives they get, is the fact that they still do feel connected to China. We don't think we're going to compromise their ability to produce work the way Candice talked about. Because if their area of work is really the kind of work that's about being radical and anti-China, they always have the right to reject the offer of being Chinese. That's being a Chinese citizen. That's a crucial nuance that was missing from her case. We aren't going to compel anyone to take this. So, assuming that China decided to reach out to some radical researcher, we don't think that will be the case. But assuming it decided to, no thank you, we don't think this person would actually accept the offer in the first place. So we think that you aren't forcing people into boxes they don't want to be in, but you aren't shutting out the industries either. Because we think in terms of the sciences, in terms of show business, in terms of celebrities, you create more interest, more international interest in these people to begin with. At the end of the day, these people don't even have a right to be protected. You don't want to protect your Chinese professors who turn out hundreds of subpar researches every year just because, well, you know, they're your citizens. Ultimately, excellence is your goal. If you can get that elsewhere, that's even better for your state. So you're basically against producing better research just because it's not by people who were natural-born citizens. Lastly, I'd like to talk about how China should position itself in the global economy, in the global community, really. We saw no response to this at all, except perhaps the idea that China should just shut itself out. This was Dwight's entire analysis when he talked to you about China wanting to enter the mainstream more. China wanting to show people that Chinese citizens aren't just people in Mao Zedong-issued jumpsuits riding on bicycles around Beijing and the like. There are also individuals in China, individuals who deviated from the conservative norms, who have faces, who have voices, who aren't conservative. That's what you show them with citizens you've reached out to who've lived elsewhere previously. Thank you.
Right, thanks Speaker for her speech, and now we invite the opposition.
We think that it's not enough for us to talk about how the Chinese should enter the international discourse on, popular culture or all the kinds of things that government bench wants to penetrate at the end of the day. Because we think that it's also important to look at the quality of decision making that we're trying to make and the effects of this not only to your international superstars, these people that we want to recognize for their good work, and also to your citizens who have been loyal to the Chinese government for a lot of years, for the decades that they've tried to go under Cultural Revolution. So for all these reasons, I'm going to point to you out 3 reasons why opposition is going to win this debate. The first is on the issue of promoting the best interests of China. The second is going to be about maximizing opportunities of these celebrities and these public figures. And lastly, we're going to talk about the urgency in entering global economies. So let's go on to the first issue. Because on this issue, Affirmative Bench argues that what they want to achieve with the policy is essentially to gain international recognition linked to their ethnic roots, to forward nationalistic sentiments, and to jumpstart tourism, ladies and gentlemen. Because the question that we first have to ask, considering that this issue is about best interest, is this really the best interest of China to begin with? Because the assumption in general, when we're talking about promoting the best interest, is that it must be able to serve the people, ladies and gentlemen. Because the question that we have to ask now is there really a problem with nationalism in China? Because if they argue, coming from Prime Minister, later after my first issue, that there's already a movement to unify the Chinese, then there's already a solution to that problem of Chinese nationalism to begin with. But while they think that it's going to help to promote the values by putting a face on the movement, we think that it's counterproductive to these Chinese efforts. Because while people will be happy and starstruck even if they live in the same cities as these popular individuals, is this a more important value to them than getting better welfare programs or pressuring the government to meet their basic necessities, ladies and gentlemen? Because in as much as they say that there's a big chunk of additional taxes and revenues to help out others, is that enough to cover the billions of population of China and the many underdeveloped rural areas like Sichuan, ladies and gentlemen? I got that example from Candice. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. But regardless of additional taxes, the second problem in general with the policy is that these people aren't the priority of the government to begin with, even if these are the people who rebuilt the Chinese nation when it underwent a century of Chinese cultural revolution to begin with. And we think that if we're going to talk about commensurability of returns to people and how they must be rewarded, we think that it must go back to the people who rebuilt the very foundations of the Chinese culture that you want to promote internationally, ladies and gentlemen. After my first issue, I promise. Because we think that this will happen because the government is now preoccupied with trying to use so much money to incentivize popular people to become its citizens. But the second level of the problem is that it disadvantages local artists and local public figures who are as traditional or as Chinese as it gets, ladies and gentlemen, because they're not given equal support. What does this imply? That these people are never going to be enough for China. That you need to recruit people because these people aren't going to bring China to the forefront of international economies and popular culture, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that it's a fair assumption for the Chinese government to make, because the reason why the Chinese have this proliferating culture is essentially because of these people who worked for it to begin with. So what does this generally mean? That if the local Chinese aren't happy with this policy, it's not in their best interest, obviously. But you aggravate the locals more, and it's a backlash to your government. Because it's either they're going to hate the people who left China to search for greener pastures, but will now have the easy way to get back into China, or they're going to not participate in your unity movements to promote nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. Either way, it's not a win-win scenario for China, because it reflects negatively on the Chinese government on the international level even. Because the idea that these Chinese governments are merely objectifying the idols of other people in other countries and turning them into puppets of the government to forward its ideals. Because instead of deconstructing the stereotypes of how the Chinese government is strict or how the Chinese government is willing to evolve, it's reinforcing these kinds of cultural stereotypes, ladies and gentlemen. So it's not going to work, especially when we can't find sources of these international artists that will fit the categories or the criteria for which the government of Chinese will filter and choose these individuals to begin with. Because most likely they're liberal or against Chinese censorship in general, because the people in China can't see them anyway if there's such a big censorship on their articles that they publish even, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the Chinese people probably won't even know about the people who won the Nobel Peace Prize or other kinds of classical writings, ladies and gentlemen. So in as much as culture evolves, is this something that conservative Chinese communist laws are going to allow even? Because, for example, your poet wants to write a piece on the Tiananmen massacre. Because, our culture is evolving anyway. Maybe I can write about it. But will the Chinese government allow it? We think that it's not going to be permissible. Because essentially, the last harm that I want to use to conclude this argument is that it provides an additional standard for citizenship on how some people get it so easily just because they're famous, while other people who are trying to work their asses off to try to get into that country and serve them in an equal manner cannot do so. Before I go on, yes.
Ma'am, why is that a wrong standard? Your ability to contribute to the state as opposed to your ability to be a really awesome engineer.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're assuming that these other people can't contribute greatly or in the same number of taxes that they can bring out, ladies and gentlemen. That just because they're popular, that they're automatically gonna suit the culture and that they're automatically going to forward the movement. That's the greatest assumption that government bench is making. But let me move on to my second issue on maximizing opportunities of celebrities and public figures. Because the idea is that we don't want to constrain these international figures from being able to fully explore their potential by allowing them to look into their other areas and other sources of creativity. But we think that because they are now under stricter laws, unlike what they are used to work with, ladies and gentlemen, that they're gonna have or gonna face greater constraints when it comes to being able to fully express themselves. Like, how can they win a Nobel Peace Prize if they wanna write about something that's bad about the Chinese government? They're never gonna be able to do that. So to a certain degree, you're always gonna censor these people, and we don't think that's good. But the last issue is probably a small issue. The idea of how we have to help the Chinese integrate into the global economy. Why do we need to help them? Everything else is made in China, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that it's a problem that the people don't know that the Chinese people exist. Not just because they're a lot in numbers, but because they produce so much of our basic resources or other raw materials that other countries produce anyway. That's why we think that for all these reasons, this policy is ultimately unnecessary, and because it's counterproductive to the goals of the Chinese movement. Thanks.
Right, I thank Speaker for her speech. We now move on to replies. The first reply from opposition.
The biggest problem with government side is their stance. Because what Chinese narrative do they really want to forward? Because at the very start, they were either ambiguous or they do not know what they want. Because in their argumentation, this is what came about. First, they either want a nationalist Chinese narrative or a globalized Chinese narrative, which DPM said is not oppressive. We don't think this is just about conservatism or liberalism, because we talk about how it's important for Chinese culture to be preserved, such as Chinese native dancers or Chinese gong players. We think Prime Minister never first gave the link of how it forwards nationalism, but more importantly, what nationalism was she talking about? Because in her argumentation, she talks about how she wants to create a nationalist narrative locally and then present that image to the international level. We think it's unfair for government side to expect that we can reasonably clash with what narrative they want to present. Because DPM and government whip tried to spin what kind of narrative they wanted to present. They said it's a globalized narrative in response to the characterization I feel because of the vacuum of Prime Minister. That these foreigners most likely have an imbibed culture from another place and they don't share the same local Chinese cultural values. We think that's unfair for their side, or they either abandon their Prime Minister because they conceded that the narrative will be a globalized one instead. Deputy Prime Minister said that with their policy, it will remove the stereotype that Chinese women all wear a cheongsam. This is very funny because any immigrant or tourist who visits Beijing or Shanghai will see women who wear power suits or who wear jeans. You don't have to naturalize this foreign ethnic Chinese to be able to show the world that you don't wear cheongsam anymore or that you follow the practice of foot binding. So we think that's a very ridiculous benefit coming from government side. But secondly, we think that a globalized Chinese should be the one that does not conform to what the global village is already or what it already expects. The globalized Chinese should be one that contributes what it is already unique about. And we said the ones you should promote are the homegrown artists who play the native gong instruments or who do the native Chinese dances. Because if you do the K-pop artist, one of the Super Junior members in South Korea is ethnically Chinese but he's a South Korean citizen. If that's the kind of culture you want to promote to the global level, that's not really adding to the globalized uniqueness of China. You're just conforming to the liberality or to the culture of global world, which they won't anyway accept because they already have Hollywood. They already have K-pop from Korea. So why would they want your copycat movement? But lastly, we think if you really want to put the face of a global Chinese, there's no weighing why it's important over continuing the conservative narrative. They said it's not about the conservative narrative, it's about the globalized narrative. First of all, this is not the trend in status quo. Because you have China cracking down on rebels in Tibet or trying to conform Hong Kong with Chinese values because it sees Hong Kong as too liberal. But secondly, it goes against reality. If you want to promote an image outside the world that you are globalized or that you're trying to be able to integrate or assimilate into the globalized world, but yet your country is conservative, billions of them in the rural areas, there will be a cognitive dissonance in terms of your own people. Because whatever you promote in the world will most likely be seen in CNN or reported by people by word of mouth because they travel to other places and whatnot. But lastly, we think that they were never responsive to Deputy Leader of Opposition. She told us how there's a backlash against China because these people who came from South Korea enjoy freedom of speech there. What will happen when they go to China? What will happen is the freedom of speech laws of China that is very restrictive will apply to that foreigner who was naturalized. So for example, if you want to put in Twitter something about the politics of government, most likely China will crack down on that. Her analysis was that the spotlight of the international community will follow that because that foreigner is very popular in the region. So there will be a backlash in terms of the image of China in entering the global community. So we think the response from government whip was that, oh, this is not realistic, this will not happen. That's very dismissive because we think the contribution of IDLO was very excellent because she's Chinese. For all those reasons, because of the ambiguity of Prime Minister in what a Chinese narrative is, they should lose.
Right, thank you very much. For the final speech of this debate, I invite Governor Fly.
Mr. Chair, I think it's quite unfair for him to insist that I present to you exactly what a Chinese person is and should be. Very many different things can encapsulate the idea of what being a Chinese is. That's why I couldn't give you a shopping list of what a Chinese person should be. There's a reason, Mr. Chair, why you want to enculturate individuals into realizing that we're not just producers of Tupperware and random household items in your house. You want to recognize that individuals who have a tie back to a certain ethnicity, to a certain ideal of excellence, to a certain value that you want to promote within a nation. Very many different values, very many different ideas. I'm pretty sure the tall basketball player, Yao Ming, will represent a very different idea than that of the actress, Mr. Chair. That's the point that Affirmative has been forwarding the entire debate that they completely missed out. It's about plurality, it's about the choices of China to be able to forward that plurality and still bring in people back to their nation to say that you are part of this community. But really, the negative team can't win simply because the main line of attacks that they had were either dismissive, nitpicky, or completely irrelevant in today's debate. Let's go through a couple of them. First is that they're not culturally Chinese. Never mind that wearing cheongsams and loving Hakao isn't the only and shouldn't be the only standard of being a Chinese in today's world. Not all old people will like them, apparently. You'll replace the real essence of the Chinese culture and create gaps between these young generation and older generation. Biggest question again, what is the real culture of these states? Because no matter what you do, given the fact that we're becoming a more globalized world, you will always have this gap present. The question is, should you address that gap and tell them that that gap isn't necessary and shouldn't be the focal point of your relationship within a nation? But then they said, well, it's not you can't prioritize these foreigners. Locals won't stand a chance against them. That's bad. They're only foreigners for as long as they're not yet nationalized within your nation. That's one thing. Because the idea of nationalization, Mr. Chair, is this. When you give back so much to the nation, when you unify a nation, when you allow them to propagate a certain value, when you give so much financing towards that country, Mr. Chair, that is enough to say that you are a part of that country. You can't tell me that a person who's willing to funnel so much taxes, thousands of dollars of taxes, should be prioritized over a local who had the great chance of having their family stay in China because they weren't scared of losing a daughter if they stayed there. In the end, Mr. Chair, we think these are all semantics. It's about your capacity to give back to the nation, to tie back to that nation, and that's present with these individuals when they are willing to come back. But then the next idea, it's hard for this person because now you force them to give up certain things like the capacity to act. Now, Mr. Chair, these journalists will be censored. I don't think it's likely for them to do that, one. And two,
Even if that's the case, that's the person's choice. We don't force people. If they want to make that cost-benefit analysis, why do we stop them? They're consenting adults. But last idea, they're getting better healthcare. And it's bad that they're getting better healthcare than poor people in the provinces who have to suffer the fact that you're funneling so much money to them. But these people are also funneling so much money back to your country. That's why the standard in already processing citizenship application right now is heavily based on your capacity to give back to the country to begin with. Because you recognize that that in itself is what you tie yourself to as a citizen. And we think in the end, the great deal that we provide coming from Affirmative to give them the ability to forward an idea of plurality of cultures, the fact that you don't harm anyone because you don't force people to become a part of your country, the benefit of supporting these individuals and the kind of prop up they get from this kind of policy, all of these things will always have and you will get from Affirmative. We don't want a homogenized China where we're all just Tupperwares. I think I have an identity. I deserve that. And I think everyone who can forward it should be out there. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. And the day is over.